From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psych, Health and Safety Canada. And I'm Kim MacDonald. I'm your host, and today my guest is Nelson Scott. And Nelson is a speaker and author and has a long history of working with businesses in hiring, retention, and engagement. And he's written a book called Thanks Again. And we're going to talk about recognition today and how important that is for workplaces. And it is one of the 13 factors for the Canadian Standard for Psychological Health and Safety. So welcome, Nelson. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Kim. Thank you for inviting me to join you this morning.
Well, with your coming on the podcast, I had to dive into the research, as I had shared with you before, because I am a research nerd. So I'm excited to get your thoughts on some of the principles and thinking around recognition and things we don't know and things perhaps we misunderstand about it, and explore it a bit from a workplace perspective. But before we get to that, can you share with our listeners a little bit about yourself and what has brought you to do the work that you do right now and the focus on recognition?
Okay, well, originally I was a newspaper reporter, but shortly that didn't last very long. So I went back to university and became an elementary school teacher. And I did that, and I moved through a number of roles, administrative roles within the school district, eventually becoming an assistant superintendent. And then probably in my mid-40s, which seems like now it's beginning to seem like a long time ago, you kind of reach that point you don't know where you want to go. And I kind of joked that, you pick up the paper on Saturday and there were three sections you could look at. You could look at the career section, you could look at the real estate section, or you could look at the personal section. And, all of them provided opportunities for a change in your life. Well, I guess the change for me is I left the school district, and partly because we were downsizing, because of what the provincial government had done. And I looked around and realized that my workload was already heavy, and it was going to become heavier, and wasn't going to do me any good. So I decided to take a year's leave of absence. Turns out maybe it's a sexist thing in the community. Men aren't supposed to take leave of absence. Somehow women can take a year off to look after the family.
Well, we can talk about that another day.
Okay, we can. So I said, I'll be doing some consulting,
Yes.
and I started doing consulting.
Wonderful.
What brought me into really focus on hiring and then staff recognition is when I was with the school district, I did a lot of work in terms of hiring. Then I started training other people how to conduct interviews, and initially within the system, and got out into the public. And there's a story that I actually tell in my first book, which was called Thanks, Great Job, right at the beginning of it, to explain how I got there. And at the end of a workshop on hiring, someone said, "Gee, that sounds like a lot of work. Why would I want to do that if they just turn around and leave after a few weeks? How do we keep them?" And my immediate response was, "Well, you got to let them know they appreciate it." Now, luckily for me, they didn't say, "And what do you mean by that?" Because at that point, I really wouldn't have been able to give a good response. And so I started researching and looking at how to deliver messages of appreciation in the workplace, how to provide recognition to staff. And that has led me sort of to our conversation today.
Great. And as you know, the podcast theme and focus is on psychological health and safety in the workplace. And I always ask my guests this question, which is, what does psychological health and safety mean to you from a workplace perspective?
From a workplace perspective, I think it's important that staff, everyone who works in a workplace feels valued as an individual and really appreciated for what they do. It's important that people work someplace where they feel comfortable being themselves, that they are someplace where they feel they belong. And I think if we feel that we belong and are happy with what we're doing, I think it really provides, it's a healthy workplace for people.
Hmm. Thanks for that. Well, that is a great answer that aligns with the Canadian standard and the recognition theme and focus that you have. So, can you, for our listeners, describe what is your definition, or how would you describe recognition if you were speaking to a new manager, a newly appointed manager in a workplace?
Well, I might go back to the root of the word, which is there's a Latin root to the word, which I would, I have enough trouble with English. I'm not going to try to say it, but basically, it says something like to remind people or to think it again or experience it again, and it's very much focused on what people have done that you notice, and just remind them of what they've done well. In terms of recognition, it's really seeing what people do and letting them know that they appreciate it. And in terms of recognition is about, there's certain, say, your organization has defined its values. Well, it's important that when you see behavior that reflects those values, that you remind people that is what you want to see more of. What makes them
Hmm.
successful? Let them know what you see and tell them they've done a good job. Sometimes people will do a good job and not even know what they did well. And as a manager or supervisor, if you can provide that feedback, it will help people grow and I think be more comfortable about it in their own skin.
When you mention that about that people may or may not know what piece of it that they did really, really well, so helping them understand their own strengths, what are is that one of the principles, or what are some of the principles or foundational pieces that would guide a workplace leader? Like, how do they know how to do it or what to do? So, are there any foundational things that they need to know about recognition?
Well, so I think about recognition in terms of consisting of five ingredients.
Okay.
And the essential ingredient is the message we deliver has to be sincere. It has to be genuine. And second thing, and that's the essential part. And the message becomes stronger when we make it relevant. In other words, we say this is what's important to be successful in our business, our organization. These are our values. Um, we want to make it be explicit. It's not enough to say to people. Well, I sometimes talk about the greeting card that you can't buy, and that is one. Thanks for nothing in particular. And of course, you can't buy that one, but you can buy one that says, thanks for everything you do. And that's not much different because we're
Right.
not being specific. So we want to be explicit in talking about it. And the other one is we're dealing with individuals. I mean, there are times that it's appropriate to recognize the whole team for what the team has achieved, but that only goes part way. People are individuals, and we have to know who they are, what's important to them, what their interests, their hobbies that they are, what their personal life is like. And we have to consider all those factors in deciding the best way to recognize people. Another thing we need to know that in terms of providing appropriate recognition is that some people prefer to be recognized in public. Others, and probably more, tell me they prefer to be recognized privately. And the last thing is recognition is like a glass of champagne or a glass of Coke. You want to deliver it while the fizz is still there. I mean,
So, oh,
Coke
sorry.
if it sits for
Okay.
too long,
So,
it doesn't. So just if I could summarize, the, the ingredients must be genuine, and the message becomes stronger if it's relevant, explicit, appropriate, and timely.
so the personalization one, I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on that because, sort of, I guess I'll leap to what are some of the barriers that you've heard or you've found on why a manager may not do, um, be able to hit all of those targets or do something that is authentic or is timely or is equitable and fair, and also that frequency. what are some of the obstacles that leaders may either they're real obstacles or maybe they have perceived obstacles to being able to do that?
Um, well, in terms of personalizing recognition, it's failing to take the time to get to know people as individuals. And if we want to create a workplace where people feel they belong, we have to know them as individuals and not as just another place. I was stopped in a pizza place to pick up a pizza, obviously, and the manager says, "Oh yeah, we've got this new person that's just joined us," and he went blank. He had no idea what her name was, and that can happen. So we don't, as basic as that, or even as basic as calling people by the name they want to be addressed by.
Mm,
Um, someone whose name is Beverly may not want to be called Bev, or Robert may not want to be called Bob, and things like that. So we need to, this very small thing, but it shows that we understand who the person is. Um, some of the barriers that exist are things like, well, we we don't know how to recognize people. Well, that's why people like me write books to provide people with tips on how to do things. Um, we haven't got the time. And one of the things, again, a theme in the book is this is for busy leaders, people who don't have a lot of time, but there are ways that you can create the time. Or we don't have any money, and a lot of people don't have a budget for recognition, and that's fine. There are no cost, inexpensive ways of expressing it. Some people don't want to recognize people because they're afraid they'll miss someone. And when I hear that, I'm reminded of what Wayne Gretzky said: "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take." It's far better to recognize almost everyone and miss someone occasionally than recognize no one. The number one reason that people leave organizations in a lot of research from Gallup and other places is that they don't feel appreciated for what they do. Um,
mm,
Bob Nelson made the comment that people will take a job for more money, but they will leave for more recognition.
mm.
Other barriers, uh, just not wanting to be different. No one else in the organization is recognizing staff. Um, So those are a few of the barriers that exist. The other barriers we create by using, well, we can get into that later if we want.
Well, right now, certainly, we know that managers are overloaded, that workload is a significant issue in Canadian workplaces and in many jurisdictions. And so that's, there's some systemic cultural workplace culture barriers as well. If, the organization is not looking at that management workload, which is another risk factor, psychosocial risk factor for the manager, and helping to make sure that they have a reasonable amount of time to do what's important and what's essential to the workplace, then obviously that barrier is created beyond even the manager. It's created from a workplace culture perspective that, managers are doers typically, but you need the time to be able to sit down and do these things intentionally. I know in your book you reference habits, how to make some of these demonstratable actions habits. Can you share a little bit about that, or how important it is to think of it as a habit and to create the circumstances so it becomes a habit?
Certainly, Kim. One of them is just scheduling a bit of time to think about who needs to be recognized. I remember a school principal telling me that every day he and his vice principals would get together and they'd say, well, who deserves to receive a thank you card from us? And they would do that. Just setting aside 15 minutes a day, maybe first thing in the morning or later in the day, and actually later in the day is a great time to. So you end your day with positive thoughts about what happened that day, or set maybe a little bit more time, less frequently during the day. So that's one way. Set about a time. Um, put staff recognition on your to-do list. Put it right at the top of your to-do list. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not sure which is the right term. Unlike everything else on your to-do list, this isn't something you're going to be able to cross out as being done, because recognition, that hopefully there's always new reasons to recognize staff. Sometimes another way to create a habit is establishing accountability. Could be your administrative assistant, it could be a colleague, could be a friend or something, and just you make the commitment, I'm going to provide more recognition, and make that person responsible for making sure that you stay on the continue to work towards that goal. A couple other ideas. These are kind of adopted from Atomic Habits by James Clear, and one of them is always associate recognition with something else that you do. You already have a habit. Maybe following a meeting, perhaps you will always sit down and kind of summarize what happened at the meeting. We'll take a moment, a little bit longer. The new habit is reflect on who contributed, and maybe you want to thank those people. Or another idea that comes is create a reward for yourself. If I get out and provide some recognition, then I have the opportunity. I'll reward myself with an opportunity to sit down with a nice cup of tea and maybe read a chapter in a mystery book or something that you want to do. So those would
Those are
be a
great
few
tips.
ways of
Yeah.
creating that habit.
I do love James Clear's attach it to another habit
Yes.
in habit creation. It's probably the most memorable piece of like his sort of model there that I think is it's so attached to human behavior and could be so effective. I really love that that's recognition becoming a habit. I had another podcast guest, Dr. Kevin Calloway, and he is a research chair from St. Mary's University in Halifax. And he had done some research around leader behavior. Well, it's all around leader behavior and organizational psychology, obviously. And he has a model called the right model, and it's really around recognition and helping to identify what's going well and to recognize that when someone does something well. And he gives like how frequently, I was going to ask you this question, how frequently does a person do this? Or is there a model that someone can follow? And maybe Kevin's model is a good one. He says at least 5 times a day. Maybe it attaches to that habit forming because it just becomes a way of doing your work every day. But from your perspective, how, if someone was trying to create a habit and set their own target to help them, keep this in place and, sort of the top of their, this is my job as a manager, what would you suggest is the frequency?
Well, I have a little tool that I give people when I'm doing in-person training, and it's called Recognition Rocks. And they literally are rocks.
They're rocks. I love rocks.
They come in a little package. They have an owner's manual. Basically what it is you set your goal for the day. Am I going to recognize 3 people or 5 people? It comes with 5 rocks, so that kind of hints maybe 5 is the right number. And you start the day with the rocks in one pocket, and each time you recognize someone, you move it to the other pocket. It works really well if you remember which pocket you started with. Some of us have trouble. It doesn't have to be rocks. I used to. It could be any
sound
token,
just
anyways.
cut out. I'm going to just note that at 1820. Yeah, your sound just cut out there.
Oh, okay.
1831. All right, let's just.
Am I
now we'll
back?
continue, and I'll get that. Yes.
Okay. So it doesn't have to be rocks. Any token will do. I used to use pennies, and I remember doing the workshop and handing out these 5 pennies to each of the participants. And at the end of the presentation, someone came up to me and said, "Thank you. That was a really wonderful presentation," or something. And I said, "Well, you're welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it." And she said, "Now I can move one of those damn pennies." So
she started right away.
she started right away. Yeah.
Now, is it practice right now? This is the best time. This is the next best time right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Who's responsible for the concept or the idea of recognition inside an organization?
Well, let me begin by talking about who's not responsible or shouldn't be responsible, and that's the Human Resources Department. They are not
Okay.
people's direct supervisors. And often it gets shifted that's, HR will look after it. And they're great people, and they really, a lot of them believe in the power of staff recognition. But they're not, what they'll end up doing is delivering more, creating formal recognition programs, but not that day-to-day recognition that I think is so meaningful. The other people that can't deliver recognition to frontline staff are the senior management, but they can create an environment where that occurs by providing the tools and the training and the budgets for frontline leaders to provide that. So I guess really what I'm saying is it is the people that should be delivering it are the immediate supervisor of the employee or the staff member. And I mean, that works up. I mean, the senior leader, the CEO should be recognizing all of the vice presidents or whatever the different people are in the corporate and the C-suite and so on, and become the role model for recognition within. But in terms of frontline staff, it should be the supervisor. And that seems to be borne out by research. That's who people want to get recognition from.
Absolutely. From an organizational perspective, and if you're looking at psychological health and safety organization-wide and recognition as a psychosocial risk factor, and the risk is that you haven't created a sense of connection or belonging, which is one of the goals of part of recognition from a health and safety management perspective, embedding that as you say, accountability into a manager's job and having that culture, that recognition is part of our culture. And I guess from a leadership perspective, really understanding the risk when we don't do this. So when this doesn't happen inside an organization, what are some of the potential risks or outcomes?
Well, you've got morale is low. People just aren't feeling happy. They aren't looking forward to Monday morning. You have people are disengaged, and by that I mean they do enough to get by. They do enough they're not going to get fired, but they don't. Part of what makes organizations successful is that people go beyond what their job description says. They volunteer to do more. And so on, and they will do that if they feel that when they do that, it is appreciated. The other thing, of course, which we've already referred to, is turnover will be high. People will start looking for jobs. And the interesting thing, I just wrote an article on this, but the interesting thing is that decision to search for a new job can begin as early as day one on the job. Depends how you're done, how you're treated on that first day. Is the organization prepared for you to arrive? Do they know you're coming? And sometimes it seems like nobody in the organization knew that would be your first day. I go back to the business line that you should hire slowly and fire quickly, and that's valid. But the other part is you should recognize immediately, and the recognition of a new staff member can begin even before their first day by just reaching out to that person, making sure that they have what they want, making sure we're ready for them when they arrive. I always say that I don't always say, but occasionally I will say, can you imagine the impact if after someone is hired, that one of the first calls they get is from the CEO of the organization, welcoming them to the organization. This may be someone they don't encounter very often, but boy, if they seem to care enough that I'm coming, I'm looking forward to being there.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all FlourishDX Academy courses included within the FlourishDX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with FlourishDX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
That's a great tip. I think that, it's the mindset that as managers that we do in our work, which is, what if you imagine that you had all the time in the world? What are the priorities that you would place inside your organization? Like, where would you spend your time if you had all the time in the world? And, taking the time out to do those kinds of things, are part of that whole culture of making recognition and, which attaches to respect, which is another, you can leap from recognition to respect, another of the psychosocial risk factors, really, really easily, because if you are recognizing me, it is a form of, demonstrating respect for me, my contribution, the work that I do. CEOs out there, take a lesson, take a page from your book and do that. If you can talk a little bit, you and I had chatted about the role of the manager before the person is hired in that process of hiring slowly, as you said, which is that onboarding process, and looking at that onboarding process a little bit differently than perhaps might be, typical in workplaces. And what's the role of the manager in onboarding, and what is the impact of the manager being more involved in onboarding?
Well, I think the manager is a connection to the work that people will be doing. If it's an education, the manager being the principal of the school. In a retail situation, whatever department the person is going to be working in, their department had a problem with that. That's a person who's going to be there. And I think the sooner there's a contact there, the better. I've written that there's a number of things that could be delegated in the hiring process, but one of the things that can't be delegated, should not be delegated, is the job offer. It should come from somebody who the potential employee sees as important, and that's going to be their supervisor. I think it's important that we don't try to, the person on their first day doesn't spend all their time filling in forms and reading policy manuals, that they actually do what they were hired to do. They have an opportunity to make a contribution. It may be a small contribution, but you want people to be able to go home at the end of the day and sit down with their family and say, I did such and such. And it must have been done well because my boss said I had done a good job. And, and again, that finding that feedback opportunity to provide some positive recognition before the end of the first day and keep the recognition flowing. Sometimes it's as simple as making sure that what the resources that the person needs to do their job are available when they arrive, that they have their business cards, they have access to a login for the computer, they're on distribution lists and things like that. There's some fun ways of making, the transition to the new jobs more appealing to people. And one of them would be send them on a scavenger hunt, require them to go out and find things that puts them in contact with the people that they'll need to get to know. Another thing that can happen is, you may be a workplace where it's not normal to wear name tags. However, and that's great because we know everybody. Well, the new person doesn't. So maybe we need to do that. Another thing you can do.
You might have resistance on that.
Well, you might, but
that's my own personal.
Okay. Well, okay. Another thing is
a banner. Sure, I'd wear a banner. I'd wear a banner.
Oh no, I mean name tags for the existing staff.
Okay, I was thinking. Thank you for clarifying that, because I was going with the new person. It's like, that's like shining a light on the new person. That sometimes
it's so the new person gets to know people.
Thank you.
Another thing we can do Having interviewed the person, having made the decision that this is the right person to hire, there had to be something that came out of that interview that that really impressed you, or a number of things. Well, sometimes the candidate doesn't really know where their strengths are, so you sit down with them and you say, Kim, when I interviewed you, uh, when you talked about how you had dealt with that, upset parent, I was very impressed by how you handled that. That really resonated with us. I think that's one of the things that's going to fit in well here when you start working with us.
Hmm.
So there's a
I
few
had.
things.
What should managers avoid if they're starting to think about, trying working on improving and increasing the frequency of recognition?
I think they need to not think that recognition has to be delivered with a lot of fanfare. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Think small. And the things that we're recognizing people for is for doing their jobs well. It's not for doing something outstanding, for which, of course, we should recognize them as well. Um, what else could I say there? It's just, I'm sorry, I've almost lost my train of thought.
Oh, no, I was just thinking for, putting in place things to do, but also thinking about what could they avoid? Like, what are some of maybe traditionally some things that we used to do that we really now know aren't as effective, or there maybe be more effective ways of doing it. So how could they, I guess, not only do what's familiar to them, think about, what should they be avoiding?
But one thing we
In
often do with recognition is we want to deliver it in public. And
mm,
I think my advice would be, in the first time you recognize someone, do it in private. Um, just because you don't know how they will respond to recognition. It also gives you a chance to learn about their thoughts about recognition, how they like to be recognized. Um, Something that often happens is people will set aside something we haven't really touched on is the power of peer recognition. And
mm,
one of the ways that we allow people to recognize their coworkers is if we're having a meeting, a staff meeting of some sort, and we provide time for people to acknowledge the contributions, how somebody else, one of their peers, has assisted them. And, it's a good idea to do that. However, you don't want to, what I would suggest is you set a time limit. Maybe only allow half a dozen people to do it and then say, well, that's all we have time for today. Let's move on. Because you never want to be created in a situation where you look around the room and there's poor little old Joe over there and no one has recognized them. And you don't want to be in the way. Well, everyone's been recognized except Joe. Come on, folks. Somebody must have something positive to say about what Joe's done in the last little while. Well, first of all, Joe's already feeling bad because he's not recognized, and now he's going to feel even worse because it's been pointed out that no one recognized him. So
mm.
you want to avoid those things that can create awkward situations. Um, I've seen people. I was one organization. I was at some sort of staff gathering, and the CEO, which was trying to do some things about recognizing, stood there and she bragged about everything she'd done to recognize staff. I recognize Kim for doing this. I recognize Charlene for doing this, and so on. And I'm thinking, recognition is not about the person delivering the recognition. It's about the person receiving the recognition. And the value of recognition isn't in the person giving it. It's in the person receiving it. They judge whether the recognition is meaningful or not. And that's a bit of a challenge, but we have to remember it's not about me. It's about them.
I think one of the pieces of that, where and you referenced it about whether someone wants it publicly or privately, and what their needs are. What motivates them. Understanding. It all circles back, Nelson. I think to some of the other things you said. Well, like, what is motivating to them, and get to know them and understand what they value in terms of what gives their workplace, life meaning. And if the more that you know about them, the more that you can be clear on the how you can do that with so that the person does feel it's authentic and that they are being recognized not as a check in a checkbox, but because the authenticity piece, seems to be the thing that's percolating or certainly connecting all of these kinds of things. In your book, you mention about, and you did already talk about this a little bit, which is buyer's remorse. The fact that as soon as sort of, and you referenced, which I just wanted to share with you, I thought it was a very interesting thought on how, as soon as we're hired, we start making determinations about this workplace, about whether we want to stay. And I did just, you referenced Gallup. So Gallup and WorkHuman are great resources for workplace leaders to find really accessible research on this topic, recognition. And, they can go to the academic literature as well, but Gallup and WorkHuman do a great job of translating it into useful information and how it relates to inclusion. And you had mentioned, a sense of belonging and connection in the workplace. And so if you have DEI goals and you are thinking about inclusion, your thoughts on recognition are really important to that work as well. So it crosses other business organizational goals that the organization might have. So it isn't a standalone activity. It relates to so much inside the organization. But the idea of when a person is hired, I start to understand about the organization. So that onboarding and recognizing them, early on seems to be a important strategy that, that's right out the gate. And as you say, doing meaningful work right out the gate and then being able to observe that. So a manager can't be everywhere and can't observe everything. What other sources of information does the manager have to be able to take that information from inside the organization and use it for their own intentional recognition plan? Like, how do they find out what's going on? Because, you want them to be able to see that, but even if they're being intentionally more observing and appreciating and then acknowledging, what other sources can they look to?
Well, a couple
inside?
ideas come to mind. One is you've got customers, clients, and they come in contact and they will provide feedback. In the book, I talk about an airport, I think the airport in St. Louis, where they actually had signs up and they invited people to give feedback on this, what's, if they had a positive experience, and they even suggested some of the values that they might be reflected in what the service they did that. So the words of customers, whether we collect them in that kind of formal way, or whether we collect them from just incidental contact. Somebody will say, that waiter provided really good service to me. Well, somehow, if you hear that, make sure those words get back to that. Quote the person. I had a client, I used to do some, in my consulting, I used to do surveys, and I was doing surveys for a school system. And one of the questions we put on the survey was something like, has there been a teacher or has there been a staff member who's made a important, had a positive impact on your educational career? And so what we found is we asked that question of students. We also asked it of parents, and people named names and they talked about it. And what our client asked us to do was collect those, divide them up, Mrs. Smith or Mr. Miller or something. And she then put together a letter to each of those people, listing all the positive comments that we received. And some of those letters were very long. It turned out to be a very time-consuming exercise, but I think the impact was pretty positive. So that, customers are one source, and the other source is the people who work within the organization. When in this book, thanks again, I talk about the power of peer recognition and what managers can do to encourage it, and then what employees can do to recognize each other. And one of the techniques I suggest there is that I guess probably that a staff member could do is they could say, boss, so and so, you probably weren't around when this happened, or you wouldn't have seen it, but when so and so did whatever they did, they can let you know, and you can then repeat those words. There's real power in quoting someone else's recognition that people received. Or
That is great.
yeah,
Yeah.
I kind of wrote.
Are there, you talked about frequency and making it a habit, so obviously that takes planning and some intention. Are there times of year that are more, I guess, more important than other times of year to do recognition, whether it's informal or formal?
I don't know that there's any particular time of year because people continue to contribute throughout the year. I had a little bit of fun when I was writing the book. I said, well, we can recognize people in a seasonal way, whether it's, I think for the season we're about to enter, I talk about recognition that falls like autumn leaves. And just, I guess there are certain dates during the year that kind of lend them things. I mean, I think October 5th is National Teacher Day, and there's National Grandparent Day in there somewhere. And of course, Thanksgiving. I think Thanksgiving is so much, just really fits in very well. I suggest it's so good we should celebrate both, or remind people to say thank you, both for the Canadian Thanksgiving and then a month and a half later for the American Thanksgiving. And American Thanksgiving, of course, occurs on a Thursday, the fourth Thursday in November. And I think, well, it's a work day here in Canada, but gee, maybe we should just declare that Thursday as Thank You Thursday. And in the workplace, everyone does that. And then it's such a good idea. Maybe we should do it once a month, or maybe every Thursday, or what the heck, let's just get around to thanking people every day. Something you can do around Thanksgiving is you could, just add a little note to if I write an email to you, if it's Kim, I may want to just add a little note as a PS and say, oh, by the way, thank you for such and such. Just something that happens is, it wasn't intentional. I used the title Thanks Again with this thought in mind, but, there's no reason that you can't thank someone twice for the same behavior. Sometimes you have an opportunity you may witness somebody do something and you can give them a nod or a thumbs up to show that you approve of what they're doing or you appreciate what they're doing. But there's no reason that you can't go back to that person later in the day or write a thank you note later in the day, just thanking them for what they did. So you can always thank people twice for the same thing.
I like that because, as humans, we see it, observe it, and go, for giving them a thumbs up, or that was a really good, but then we think more in a more robust or richer way if we're trying to make it very personalized and really understand what, the person and what's important to them. Then you can make a richer thank you that, identifies a strength they have or unveils a strength that they didn't know they had. So you can add some of that richness if you do it the second time, I think, too, which really gets to that connection and respect and sense of belonging and inclusion. So I like that too, the two-step model.
I appreciate that. Actually, I wish I'd thought of saying that. That's so much more brilliant than what I can come up with.
Yeah, I got 1,000 of them now. No, but I'm just thinking that two-step, kind of taking that because, we are busy. And it's like the busy in the moment, but then also, as a manager, that time to reflect on the day. And that might be the time to be able to spend a bit more time on it, and make it more personal and think more about, what are their strengths. Might also be helpful in that, and you had mentioned about the peer recognition, which I love, that our brains are hardwired for negative observations, what's going wrong. And as a manager, sometimes I've done it myself in my other roles, which is trying to be a coach or a mentor. And so you're looking for things in areas of improvement as opposed to looking for what's going right, and helping the workplace as a leader by demonstrating that yourself. So you're looking for what's going right, not looking for what's potentially has to be fixed. And that's a practice. That's a mindset practice for sure, because we are hardwired for that negative, observing it more easily if it's going to have a risk or a negative impact. So
Yeah,
I do think it takes practice.
and often we set ourselves up for, and staff members up for frustration because we land up focusing on something that they do well, and we talk about how to improve that. And we should be looking at what they do well and thinking about how we can build on that.
Mm.
And I just want to go back to something that
Yeah.
you said, and you talk about how busy people are, and they are, and that's acknowledged in the title, subtitle of my new book. But it's interesting. We can always find time. We're forced to find time to conduct job search interviews and things like that when we have a vacancy. We always can find time to do that, and we should be also able to find time to avoid those situations by making people feel that they're appreciated, that they are where they belong.
Mm.
And let me.
for
Can I
that.
tell you one more story?
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
this is
Before we
from
wrap up,
my
yeah.
first book, but um, I remember I talked about the value of family actually in both books, and in the first book I told a story about a plumber and how he was middle-aged, and I wrote something nice about him. His boss showed it to him, and he told his mother, and his mother phoned me. So I'm telling this story at a teachers convention. Afterwards, a woman comes up to me and she says, that really resonated with me because a few weeks ago my mother was here visiting, and on the weekend I took her over to show around the school that I work in. And we bumped into the principal, who just happened to be there, and he talked to my mother about how much they appreciated having me on staff and what a contribution I was making to the education of children. And she says, ever since then, anytime I say to my mother, I'm thinking maybe I should move on and go someplace else, she says, why would you do that? Why would you leave a place where they really appreciate you for what you do? The mother became a key member of that school's
The retention
team.
strategy. That's fabulous. There she is, being part of their retention planning for their teachers. That's great. Are there any final tips, Nelson, that you want to share before we wrap up? Like things that you really want managers or organizational leaders, the senior leaders, to be thinking about with regard to either managing the risks that are associated with not giving this attention or in helping to make improvement?
I think the thought I'd leave you with is just it creates a workplace. When you create a workplace with a culture of appreciation and respect and recognition, that is going to make a big difference. We talked about this as one of the factors in mental health, but it really reflects, in terms of recognition influences culture and respect, and even by making recognition relevant, it talks about creating pretty clear expectations of what we want people to be doing. So I think recognition can create a workplace where people want to be, and where they belong, and where they want to stay. Why, if you feel appreciated, if you feel valued, why would you ever want to leave? And organizations become successful when they have a continuity of staff, month after month. I think that's my
Thank you for
thought
that.
to end with.
That is wonderful. Thank you, Nelson, and thank you so much for all your thoughts and for the opportunity to find out more in your book. I really appreciated that. It sparked all kinds of ideas for myself. And if people want to connect with you or reach out to you or find out about your book or find out about your work, how could they connect with you?
Well, I guess I'm on LinkedIn, so that may be the best place to go.
Okay.
I do have a website, which unfortunately is way out of date, and that's called, greatstaffrecognition.com.
Okay.
And you can connect with me there. Those might be the best ways of connecting to. You can email me. My email is nmscott@telus.net. So those are a few ways to do that.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And thanks to all of our listeners for listening in on this important conversation. There's so much more from a recognition perspective to explore and understand, but we'll wrap it up here. And if you're here and listening to this podcast, wherever you are, check out the other episodes for other topics that we cover. And please share with colleagues and your network, because that's how we expand our goal of helping to reach workplace leaders in Canada and help them integrate and think more about psychological health and safety and its impact on mental health and well-being at work. And you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn or on our website, 13factors.ca. And thanks to FlourishDX for sponsoring this podcast and making it all happen. And until next time.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the FlourishDX community at www.flourishdx.com.